Do you ever wonder why life has to be so hard? Why, when we come to believe in Jesus, doesn't it get easier? Isn't that what's supposed to happen? I can't find anywhere in the Bible where it says life gets easier when you become a Christian. In fact, Paul and Peter both tell us it gets harder. What changes is not life, but us. We still face challenges, even when we make all the right choices, and even when we truly believe. Why do you suppose that is? I've been thinking a lot about Paul this week. Here was a man who had power and authority. Acts tells us that he set off on the Damascus Road armed with letters from the high priest and breathing fire and murder. This was a man who had faith in what he was doing. He believed that he was protecting the Jewish religion from blasphemy. And he believed that this was so important, he was justified in using violence. He had a purpose. The political leaders supported him, and in that place and time, that meant God was with him. Maybe in our place and time too. Paul was justified in having confidence that he was doing the right thing. But something happened he did not expect. Acts tells us, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. Paul had an encounter with a higher authority. Everything he thought he knew, everything he thought his life was about, got turned upside down. And this man with power and confidence left the encounter blind and helpless. He had to be led into Damascus. Were it not for Ananias, Paul might have ended up as a street beggar. But God, who blinded him, had a plan. This is what it took to get Paul's attention. And God wasn't finished yet. Acts tells us that Paul immediately began preaching about Jesus, apparently with the same fervor he used against Jesus, because suddenly his old friends were plotting to kill him. In Damascus, in Jerusalem, they wanted him dead. Maybe that's simply because he switched sides, but Acts hints that there was another reason. The disciples sent Paul off to Tarsus, and then, Acts says, then the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace and was strengthened. Sometimes we do what we think God wants us to do, but we aren't ready yet. Paul wanted to be important. He argued with everyone, but this wasn't good for the church. Paul himself would later write, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So Paul went off to Tarsus, and apparently, as he writes in Galatians, to Arabia. He lived in the desert for some time. He also tells us in Galatians that it was 14 years before he approached the leaders in Jerusalem about becoming a missionary to the Gentiles. This was the ministry God had called him to. But it took Paul time to be ready. And not just time. Paul gained humility and understanding. He studied. He remained an abrasive speaker and often had to leave town after preaching because people wanted to kill him. But he became an effective instrument for God and an apostle we still look to today. The prophets and the Psalms speak of being refined by fire. God uses challenges to prepare us for his work. After all, if I wanted to run a marathon, I'd have to do a lot of training before I could even think about it. Through challenges, we are strengthened. But we live in a culture that says life should be easy. Do you know there's not another culture on earth that believes that? Every other culture realizes that life comes with hardships. What matters is how we deal with those hardships. It's only us here in the richest nation on earth that believes life should be easy. When it gets hard, when we have to make sacrifices, when it hurts, how often do we whine and complain? We worship a God of comfort, and that's not the true God. The challenges we face burn away all that is not of God, our idols, our fears, our worldly desires, but only if we turn to God in those challenges. A few years ago, I saw a vision of myself taking a swan dive backward off the roof of a tall building. I was being asked to trust God. I had already been clean more than 25 years, and I accepted that the years I spent in addiction were necessary to prepare me for what lay ahead. But at the time of this vision, my life was a mess. I was struggling with health issues. So was my wife. We'd had to close our business. We were struggling with spiritual darkness. I thought if I trusted God, things would become easy. That's not what happened. I asked God what I was supposed to do. At first, he said, sit. So we sat. And I kept asking. And one day he has said, seminary. And I said, no, really, God, what am I supposed to do? 2 years later, we moved across the country so I could attend seminary. I envisioned a leisurely family trip. The move became 11 days of hell. I envisioned a relaxing summer as we prepared for my education. That wasn't what we got. Our family had 10 ER visits in 6 weeks. All 4 of us went at least once. But that summer ended with a powerful spiritual experience with a team of deliverance ministers. I expected to begin seminary and know soon what my calling was. But it took 3 years before I began to understand what God wanted from me. For 3 years, I struggled with doing all that work and not knowing why. I went through periods of depression and apathy, but I kept coming back to this. It's what God told me to do, and I'll do it even though I don't understand. Now I think I do know why he asked me to do that. But life still isn't easy. God is still working on me, burning away my mistrust and my worldly desires. On the days I accept and trust that, I get through much more easily. On the days I rebel, I suffer, because I can only explain these challenges in worldly terms and by worldly standards. By worldly standards, I'm not much of a success. By worldly standards, neither was Paul, or Stephen, or Peter, or Jesus. Paul arrived in Damascus blind, helpless, and dependent on charity. Everything in us rebels against that. We don't want to be helpless. Society tells us being helpless means failure. But that's where we find God. That's where all our beliefs about the world and ourselves get challenged. That's the beginning of healing. So long as we think we have the answers, there is no healing. But once we realize that God is God and we're not, healing can begin. That doesn't mean it'll be easy or quick. Peter spent 3 years traveling with Jesus and still denied him. Paul spent 14 years preparing for his mission. I'm an even slower learner, or maybe I'm just more stubborn. It took 35 years from the time God lifted me from darkness until I finally became ready for this ministry. And I suspect God isn't done with me yet. We all face challenges. Maybe you're facing a tough one today. Maybe, like me, you've wondered, why does it have to be so hard? The answer is simple. It has to be hard enough to change us the way God wants us to be changed. That's how healing begins.